The Adventures of Jonathan Wild. The Curious Case of Mrs. Rosepedal's Disappearance in Ravensbrook is a fictional story written and produced by Pierre Anthony and narrated by Andrew. The Disappearance. The quaint town of Ravensbrook was known for its serene atmosphere, cobblestone streets, and the ever-blooming roses that lined the paths. However, the tranquility was shattered when Mrs. Rosepedal, the beloved florist and town's favorite gardener, went missing. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community, and the townsfolk were desperate for answers. Jonathan Wild, the renowned detective, was summoned to investigate the perplexing case. He arrived in Ravensbrook on a crisp autumn morning, greeted by anxious faces and a palpable sense of unease. "Mr. Wild, thank you for coming," said Mayor Thornton, shaking Jonathan's hand with a firm grip. "Mrs. Rosepedal was last seen 2 nights ago. She was preparing bouquets for the Harvest Festival, and then she vanished without a trace." Jonathan nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the town square. "I will need to speak with anyone who had contact with her that day, and I'll need access to her shop and garden." The mayor agreed and led Jonathan to Rosepedal's Florist, a charming little shop adorned with vibrant flowers and lush greenery. The investigation. Inside the shop, Jonathan met Lila, Mrs. Rosepedal's young assistant. She was pale and distraught, her eyes red from crying. "I was the last person to see her," Lila said, her voice trembling. "We were working late, and she sent me home around 8 p.m. When I came back the next morning, she was gone. The door was unlocked, but nothing seemed out of place." Jonathan inspected the shop meticulously. He noticed a half-prepared bouquet on the counter, as if Mrs. Rosepedal had been interrupted. In the garden, he found trampled flower beds and a broken pot near the back gate, indicating a struggle. "Did Mrs. Rosepedal have any enemies or conflicts?" Jonathan asked. Lila shook her head. "Everyone loved her. She was kind and gentle, always helping others." Jonathan pondered this information. What about any recent visitors or strange occurrences? Lila hesitated. "There was a man, a stranger, who came by a few days ago. He seemed very interested in the rare blue orchids Mrs. Rosepedal had grown. She said they were not for sale, but he was insistent." The hidden clue. Jonathan decided to follow this lead and began questioning the townsfolk about the mysterious stranger. Descriptions varied, but the consensus was that he was tall, with a scar on his left cheek and a foreign accent. As Jonathan delved deeper, he discovered that the man had been staying at the Ravensbrook Inn. The innkeeper, Mrs. Haversham, confirmed the stranger had checked out the morning after Mrs. Rosepedal disappeared. "He left in a hurry," she said. "Didn't even stay for breakfast, and he paid in cash." Jonathan searched the room the man had stayed in and found a small piece of paper wedged under the bed. It was a letter addressed to E. Montgomery, instructing him to acquire the blue orchids at any cost and to deliver them to an address in a nearby town. The confrontation. Jonathan knew he had to act quickly. He hired a carriage and made his way to the address specified in the letter. It led him to an abandoned manor on the outskirts of the neighboring town. The manor was overgrown with ivy and surrounded by a dense forest. Jonathan approached cautiously, his revolver ready. Inside, he found Mrs. Rosepedal, tied to a chair but unharmed. She looked up, her eyes filled with relief as she saw her rescuer. "Mr. Wild, thank heavens you found me," she exclaimed. Jonathan untied her quickly. "Are you all right, Mrs. Rosepedal? What happened?" She explained that E. Montgomery had tried to force her to hand over the blue orchids, which she had refused. He had kidnapped her, hoping to use her knowledge to find and harvest them himself. As they made their way out of the manor, Montgomery appeared, blocking their path with a sinister grin. "You're not going anywhere," he sneered, pulling out a knife. Jonathan acted swiftly. He knocked the knife from Montgomery's hand and subdued him in a matter of moments. Montgomery was soon bound and handed over to the local authorities. The resolution. Back in Ravensbrook, Mrs. Rosepedal was welcomed with open arms and heartfelt tears. The harvest festival proceeded as planned, with her blue orchids as the centerpiece. "Mr. Wilde, how can I ever thank you?" Mrs. Rosepedal said, her eyes shining with gratitude. Jonathan smiled warmly. "No need for thanks. Just promise me you'll be more cautious in the future. Rare flowers can attract unwanted attention." As he departed Ravensbrook, Jonathan felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The curious case of Mrs. Rosepedal's disappearance had been solved, and peace was restored to the town. Yet, he knew that wherever mystery and danger lurked, his services would always be in demand. And so, the adventures of Jonathan Wilde continued, with each new case bringing its own challenges and rewards. But the grateful smiles and the restored harmony of Ravensbrook would remain etched in his memory forever. Always shine bright, despite controversy.